Thank you very much for a quantitative analysis, a quantitative report, which gradually brings us into data, facts, figures. From assumptions, we go or switch to statistics. And as last presentation in this session, for the last presentation in this session, I would like to invite Edgars Berziņs, an architect and urban planner, to talk about the objectives and the criteria for the revitalization of Riga micro-unit housing. Mr. Berzins has worked on this topic quite a while. Last year, he presented a detailed research on the ways of improving the quality of residential housing. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Various things, and one of the main conclusions I've arrived at, also analyzing the large-scale residential area, is the conclusion that we don't have enough research, basically, that it's under-researched topic. So we're researching various spatial aspects, social aspects, but there are very few economic researches or analyses available. And we should not forget these research as well. So my presentation to a large extent will focus on the necessity to conduct further research in this area. So this is a popular scientific conference. Therefore, I would like to start with a slight literary off-topic. All of you remember that in Soviet times, censorship affected also the classics. And when Dialith Theatre staged Fire by Blaumanis, with the original text, we saw what disappeared as a result of censorship. And Madame Horst was saying that all trouble comes from Moscow. Of course, censors would never let this through. So Moscow, in the case of Blaumanis, was, of course, a bar or a motel on the side of the road, or tavern on the Moscow road, and then men, got lost there. So that was why or where all the troubles began. But why am I mentioning this? Because our attitude towards large-scale residential areas has been predominantly negative. And a lot of inhabitants think that indeed, all the trouble comes from Moscow or from elsewhere. However, that is not entirely true. And this is what I had to do, and you can find it in City Architect's webpage, and I'll try to bring it or put it in the context. So this is about revitalizing or giving a second life. But since I started with Moscow, let me first talk about the first life. We know that the residential micro-unit housing emerged in West, not in East, and it was a response to a crisis, a housing crisis in the post-war Europe. And there are some economic aspects that we must also take into account. Crisis ended, and in the countries where a private property is very popular, development of residential areas basically stopped. Of course, residential houses are still built these days, but massive or large-scale construction basically stopped. Whereas in countries where private property was not allowed, the development of residential areas continued even up to the beginning of the 1990s. As a result of that, And I'm not the only one who thinks this way. The residential area volumes reached excessive amounts. We know that there should be a balance between private housing and residential housing. What are the conditions that favor it, and how to achieve it, and whether we'll be able to achieve it all, and when will we achieve it? Those are the questions that we need to answer. And these are very, very important questions, because if we identify ourselves or associate ourselves to Western countries, Western European countries, we're very similar, really. If we compare ourselves to them, we're not looking forward to big volumes or big intensity.
A couple of words about the process, how it took place. During the Soviet times, the state regulated the residential system. There were certain types of residential building determined, and the territories for residential buildings were planned, and all of the manufacturing and installation and mounting was also carried out by the state, and the commissioning was carried out by the state. Therefore, no one can actually be surprised about the quality. Then the residential places or apartments were delivered for inhabitation by means of queuing up. Then some apartments were appointed as a compensation instead of the demolished houses. I remember that the first public transport line which didn't go through the city center. It went from Vecmilgravs to Purcēns, and it was because the people moved from living in Vecmilgravs to Purcēns. And this traffic intensity was so high that another public transport line was necessary in order to tackle the problem. The dwelling space was regulated, and no one could pick the standard of the housing or the place of the housing. Well, you could reject it, you could refuse. And also the exchange rights existed. And to small amounts, the cooperative forms of housing existed. Why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you this because the basis or the grounds for the negativism which exists or which existed and exists up to the day stems from there. Well, not everything was negative or bad. An apartment in a new residential area was of a higher standard than a communal apartment in an unrenovated building. Another great asset or pro was the fact that the regulations determined the common outdoor space. However, we heard that nowadays approximately 60% of the inhabitants do not actually make use of this territory. Another positive point was the fact that these districts or residential areas were shaped as units which were provided simultaneously with public infrastructure. Well, certainly the infrastructure lagged behind and it wasn't, and some of the plans were not implemented still. For example, Tangarak's polyclinic, the ambulance, is still not built. And finally, in terms of the outdoor space, I would like to mention a very important thing. People need their own land. And, this was the forbidden fruit during the Soviet times because it was prohibited to build houses, private houses in cities. It was allowed in collective farms, however. And when the food program was launched, then it triggered high activity. We know that we have various we have horticulture enterprises, more than 100,000 horticulture enterprises, and it has not been lost anywhere. The years of boom showed us that the suburbanization is still ahead of us. It's a state that we will still reach in some years. And this actually would be a very good point for another research to be held. Not Mr. Schmaeling, but Georg Schöning instead said the following: if we agree to the statement, I'm not going to read it out to you, then you have to read it yourself. And what I would like to mention that is, if we agree to this, then we have to satisfy the interest of people, their interest into their own land parcels. Well, not everyone needs that, but we don't know how many need it. Several polls and studies have been conducted in this regard. Some were held in 2005, some were held in 2010. And up to 80% of the respondents said that they wish to live in their own house, own private house, which has a land parcel around it. And this is the contradiction that we face. Namely, people are satisfied by how genuine is this satisfaction. If we state something completely different in other polls and studies, I think that there are instruments in place which could help us elicit the truth. Finally, as for the, so to say, first life or the first breath, I have to conclude that we have admitted many mistakes. And particularly, this is true for the cases where we thought that we excel at, where we are best at. We have denationalized land, and we have built other properties there in those land parcels. And this is the limiting factor, the restricting factor, which actually hinders the development of the urban space. This actually turns the development into a business project. We're not going to plan or replan the large residential areas. We have to structurize these areas in smaller units. We have to restructure or redistribute them. And there, this business could be possible. This image is also another point of study of the research that I conducted, and it illustrates the situation that has evolved. What we see here is a large landowner, and it had a line, a red line going diagonally. And then we see that in the north part, the new owners have been able to obtain smaller land parcels so that they have to pay less in taxes. And this results in the current situation. And it is not a good result visually. Well, you see the remainders of the children's playground, and it does not belong to the building. It is another person's property. What I would like to end with regarding the first life, I have a question which has evolved. How do we eliminate the negative consequences? How do we limit the proprietary rights with social responsibility? And one of the most crucial questions that appears is, how do we tidy up or clear up this matter? By and large, this is a matter of business, but we have to assess it, and we have to become aware of how it could develop and proceed in the future. If we look at it from the point of view of owners, then the situation is in the large-scale dwelling spaces. identifies three types of owners. There are owners which have both land and houses. Well, the number of them is very small, but it still exists. Then we have owners who own land, and somebody is enforced to pay tenancy fees for this land. And then this territory is used as, as a place for walking dogs. And the third category is the people who own either apartments or buildings. And this illustrates the aims that we have to have in place in the nearest future. But in any case, we have to conduct studies also in this regard. Now, how are we breathing and what are we living right now? Some speakers already mentioned this, and some already repeated, because we know that there are not so many studies in place. So there's the study which was conducted in 2008, and then there's this poll conducted by the City Council in 2013. And if we look into these polls, then we see that some 95% of the inhabitants are very satisfied or satisfied. And then logically, obviously, we obtain the question, so why are we beating about the bush? Why do we think that this is a problem? Why do we have to outline this as a very important task for development? There would be some other problems which would be much more topical. We know that Purcēns is appealing to some 72% of inhabitants. However, some 78% of the inhabitants mention that they don't even know their neighbors. And this is another question or problem that we encounter. How can we develop something if we don't have this social commonness or social cohesion? Only some 24% wish to provide their buildings with thermal insulation. And I checked the last two lines, which were outlined in the development program. And this development program was delivered to negotiations, to public discussions. And it outlined that some 75% think that the quality is generally in the city is of sufficient quality, and some 70% say that in their residential area the quality is good. And we know that the increase in this area will be 3% up to 2020. So basically, no comments. These are the most satisfied people, right? It was mentioned by one of the previous speakers that this is mentioned by age groups. So how come we can't do without the research? Well, we know that housing is one of the key, most important and crucial interests of people. And in our development model, the human being assumes the core, the most important role. And the human being is characterized by interests. Human beings have interests. They can be general or personified or personal, but generally we talk about the general ones. As the society develops, these interests change. And these interests also depend on the opportunities. And sometimes they are even unconscious. But we have to know them. We have to be aware of them. And sometimes these interests are invisible or they are not elicited, but we have to clarify what are those. We have to understand also that the interests shape the goal. Therefore, we can state clearly that interests define goals. And when we model interests, I already mentioned that we are talking about the general situation here. We have to discuss the sustainability matters, which means the social, the economical, and the spatial one. And we will, if we don't observe this, then we will most probably relapse with these problems at all levels. Without that, we cannot speak about integrated tasks and sustainable solutions, which are actually the basis of everything. And most probably I will skip criteria, but the main idea is as follows. By means of criteria, we check goals, we verify our goals. And the integrated solutions, which are related to the second life, the business plans of the second life, they basically shape the basis, starting from energy efficiency and